Thank you. The Subcommittee on Financial Services and General Government will come to order. I'd like to welcome IRS Commissioner Werfel. This is the first time you've appeared before the subcommittee, and we look forward to discussing the IRS's fiscal year 2025 budget submission. This is also my first hearing as chairman of the subcommittee, and I'm looking forward to conducting this oversight with the agencies under the subcommittee's jurisdiction whose mission impacts the everyday lives of hardworking Americans in my district and across the nation. It's my duty to ensure that the agencies, including the IRS, do not unfairly target Americans in auditing their taxes, overseeing their participation in financial markets, and impacting their ability to own or operate a small business. Start? Okay, thank you. The fiscal year 2025 budget request for the IRS is $12.3 billion. This is equal to this current fiscal year. However, the IRS is requesting an additional $24 billion in mandatory funds to rebuild an army of IRS agents and carry out a direct file system that Congress did not authorize, among other enforcement priorities. The IRS claims that the rescissions enacted as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act undermine the nation's financial strength, when in fact requesting to reverse that cut on top of an additional $24 billion in mandatory funds does just that. And while the IRS deserves credit for a successful filing season, it claims it can't even come close to achieving an 88% level of service without additional mandatory funds. Specifically, Commissioner Werfel has said without additional funds, the level of service on the IRS main phone line could drop back to 30% levels in 2026. It's worth exploring why the IRS says it cannot deliver a successful filing season with the discretionary funds this subcommittee provides, especially considering that these funds account for almost half the subcommittee's allocation. We need to get back to hearing from the IRS and how it is effectively deploying the discretionary resources to improve its modernization efforts and better secure taxpayer data. I'd also like to hear from the IRS on how the administration is complying with their pledge that taxpayers' incomes under $400,000 are not experiencing an increase in audit activity by the IRS. They have enough to worry about amidst higher grocery, rent, and utility bills. It is our job as appropriators to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollars and ensure that American people, that the agencies under our jurisdiction are not wasting money by supporting bad policies that fail to achieve desired outcomes. Now I'll turn to my friend and ranking member, Mr. Hoyer, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the chairmanship of this committee. I look forward to working with you, as I looked forward to and had a great relationship, as you know, with your predecessor, who is now our ranking member on the majority side. And I want to thank him for his leadership. And I know that you will bring the same kind of measured work to this committee's very important efforts as he did. I want to start by saying that, commenting on a comment you made. Unfortunately, the allocation historically to this committee is insufficient to meet the responsibilities of this committee. And because the objects of this committee are not necessarily of most interest either to the public or to the members. However, the work of this committee, and particularly the Internal Revenue Service, is absolutely critical to all other objectives that are covered by the Appropriations Committee, and we ought to keep that in mind. I want to thank Commissioner Werfel for joining us on Capitol Hill today. I look forward to hearing more from you about all the IRS accomplished this year. I read your testimony. It is very impressive, the level of service and the increase that we have given to the American public. And I'm sure while they don't fully appreciate the ease with which you've made this an experience that none of us like, much better. The agency made important progress in its efforts to implement the strategic operating plan that it laid out a year ago and recently updated to enhance taxpayer services. We saw those initiatives yield impressive results in the most recent tax filing season, with the IRS fielding 1 million more customer service calls than it did during the 23 season. On average, calls only had to wait on hold for 3 minutes. I wish most of the private sector calls that I make were answered as quickly. That's a minute shorter than last year, otherwise known as 25%, and 5 minutes shorter than the 2022 filing system. The last season before we secured additional IRS funding for the Inflation Reduction Act. The 2024 filing season also saw the IRS make important technological advances to improve the taxpayer experience, from its paperless processing initiative to its new direct file pilot program. As a longtime supporter of direct file, I was pleased to see the pilot program exceeded its target goal. With more than 140,000 taxpayers across 12 states participating. Thanks to funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS also improved tax enforcement for high earners, successfully collecting $520 million in legally owed back taxes from roughly 1,000 millionaires and billionaires. These are just a few of the IRS's achievements from the year. I'm sure Commissioner Werfel will highlight many others. I mention these accomplishments because they demonstrate what the IRS is capable of when it receives the resources it needs to carry out its absolutely critical work for the U.S. Government, for the American people, and for our success. If Congress withhold these resources, it puts all that progress at risk. Sadly, that is exactly what many of my friends across the aisle continue to do. The antipathy directed at IRS and its employees is unfortunate, and it demonstrates an antipathy towards government. In the appropriations for fiscal year 2024, they rescinded more than $20 billion in Inflation Reduction Act funding for the agency. Let's be clear about what underfunding the IRS means for the American taxpayer. It means IRS customer service hold times will climb right back up. It means initiatives like direct file will be delayed or put on hold. It means more high earners will be able to get out of paying the taxes that they owe under laws that are already on the books. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but all of us ought to pay the taxes that are legally owed under the laws that we pass. And Americans are particularly aggrieved when they think they are paying more than their fair share, where corporate executives are paying less than the people who work for them in terms of percentage. Crucially, cutting IRS funding will add to our national debt. You cannot be concerned with the national debt if you're not concerned with collecting legally owed revenues to fund our critical national defense and domestic security. Many of my Republican colleagues claim they care about fiscal responsibility. If that's the case, then they ought to care about enforcing the law and collecting legally owed revenue. They ought to work with us to not only fulfill the administration's request for IRS funding, but to secure additional resources to offset what was taken from the agency through the recent rescissions. Now, I will not be putting forward the graphs that I used during the markup, but the workload of IRS has escalated geometrically, and its resources to meet those needs have been dramatically reduced over the decades. I look forward to hearing from the Commissioner about why this funding is so crucial. He can illuminate all that the IRS has accomplished with these resources in the past year, as well as the consequences that underfunding the agency would have on the nation. Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I think I went 1 minute and 35 seconds over. I apologize for that, but I think I needed to say all that I said.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyer. I will now turn to the Ranking Member DeLauro for her remarks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. I thank you both for holding this hearing today. And Commissioner Werfel, thank you for being here today. Welcome to the Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee. Thank you so much for your public service. We really appreciate your work. And it is vitally important for our nation's governance, for our national security, and for every program service provided to the American people that we have a strong, secure, and a well-supported Internal Revenue Service. An underfunded IRS means slower processing of Americans' tax returns. and delays to crucial benefits like the child tax credit. And I'll take a second on the child tax credit because there were folks who told us in 2020 that one, we could not have an improved and expanded child tax credit, and then secondly, that we couldn't get the IRS to be able to deliver the checks on a monthly basis, that would never happen. And huzzah, the IRS delivered the checks on a monthly basis starting that July, and with 98% accuracy in getting the payments out to whom they were to go to. So I thank you for that, and the families thank you for that. But underfunding the IRS means that those with the most resources, like billionaires and powerful corporations, can often escape scrutiny and avoid paying taxes when the IRS cannot afford to ensure that they are meeting their obligations. 2021, at least 55 of the largest corporations in America, in a year where they took in over $40 billion in pre-tax income, paid no federal corporate income taxes, zero, nada, nothing. Corporations like Nike, Hewlett-Packard, the Dish Network paid zero federal income taxes, profiting on the backs of honest American families. Every dollar the IRS spends on auditing the average account yields just over $2, a notable return on investment. But for the wealthiest tenth of 1%, audits produce nearly triple the return, with each dollar yielding over $6 in revenue. Through last year's debate over IRS funding, we would hear some members of the majority improperly call this activity the IRS collecting tax that is legally owed, a tax increase. Complete nonsense. We protect honest, hardworking, tax-paying Americans by ensuring that the wealthiest individuals and corporations are paying the taxes that they owe. This committee has made several investments annually and in the Inflation Reduction Act in the IRS to ensure it has the resources to collect taxes owed, to improve services. And indeed, there has been great progress in modernizing the IRS for the American people. With our investments, the IRS has significantly improved customer service with call wait times of just over 3 minutes and a 37% increase of taxpayers served in person. The IRS is also piloting a direct file program allowing taxpayers in 12 states with simple returns to file for free directly with the IRS. There is simply no good reason that American taxpayers are all but forced to use costly private services to be sure they are paying their taxes correctly. The government, at a minimum, should be able to tell taxpayers if they are paying the amounts they owe. This is an important step forward in making government work better for people. And critically, now that it has the resources to audit the wealthiest individuals and corporations, the IRS has collected $520 million in back taxes from roughly 1,000 delinquent millionaires and billionaires. Rolling these investments back would only serve those who seek to escape paying the taxes that they owe, getting a free ride on the backs of hardworking and honest American families. This committee must continue to ensure the IRS has the resources to complete its mission. It would be foolish for a business to slash its accounts receivable department in an effort to save money. The U.S. government should not do so either. Thank you for being here and for your public service to our country. I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Lauro, Commissioner Werfel, welcome again. Without objection, your full written testimony is going to be entered into the record. With that in mind, I'd ask you to give us a summarization of your opening statement in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Joyce, Ranking Member Hoyer, Ranking Member DeLauro, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the filing season and the IRS budget. I'm pleased to report that we saw a strong 2024 tax season for the nation, one of our best in history. Through the April filing deadline, the IRS received more than 139 million individual income tax returns and issued more than 86 million refunds for more than $245 billion. The Inflation Reduction Act funding has enabled the IRS to have one of its best filing seasons ever in terms of customer service. taxpayers are seeing a difference. We've answered over 1 million more taxpayer calls than we did a year ago, and 3 million more calls than we did in 2022. Wait times and level of service on our main phone lines have improved. We've dramatically expanded service in our walk-in sites, increasing hours and serving more taxpayers. And new and expanded tools on irs.gov are seeing heavy use. At the same time, Inflation Reduction Act funding has enabled us to begin making critical inroads in addressing tax evasion amongst the most complex and largest filers. This is a sharp turnaround from the past decade when we were hindered by a lack of resources. Our compliance work includes focusing on tax delinquency and non-filing among high-income individuals and tax evasion among the largest and most complex partnerships and corporations. As I have previously noted, we remain committed to following the Treasury's directive not to increase audit rates relative to historic levels for small businesses and households earning less than $400,000 per year. Historic levels will be defined by tax year 2018, where rates for all cohorts were at historic lows. Notably, audit rates for various groups are made public each year in our data book. Therefore, when the final audit rate for tax year 23, the first full tax year following the enactment of the IRA, is available, the public will be able to compare the rates to historical levels and confirm that the IRS successfully met Secretary Yellen's directive. In the meantime, we are working to develop a methodology that gives us additional information on the technical aspects to determine which taxpayers fall above or below the $400,000 income threshold. We will, of course, keep lawmakers and members of the public updated on this work as appropriate. The IRS anticipates increasing audits on the wealthiest taxpayers, largest corporations, large and complex partnerships by sizable percentages for tax year 26. For example, the IRS will nearly triple audit rates on large corporations with assets over $250 million in tax year 26, increase audit rates by nearly tenfold on large complex partnerships with assets over $10 million, and increase audit rates by more than 50% on wealthy individual taxpayers with total positive income over $10 million. That's where our focus will be. Again, I want to be clear, middle and low-income taxpayers should know that there's no new wave of audits coming. We are laser-focused on using new IRA dollars to increase scrutiny on those large and complex tax filers that are showing red flags for potential tax evasion. In all our transformation work, the IRS has still much more work to do on many fronts. This includes closing remaining gaps on phone service, expanding digital options, further strengthening data security, and supporting vulnerable populations by protecting them from scams and increasing access to refundable credits. We have an opportunity to build a 21st century tax agency to serve the American people in the manner they expect and at the level they deserve. Our ongoing success hinges on sustained investments to make sure that we have the right size workforce with the right training and tools. We also need a modern technology infrastructure with web-enabled tools for taxpayers. These are needed to serve the nation today and in the future. A critical part of the effort is the administration's fiscal year 25 budget proposal. It gives us flexibility and increases IRS transfer authority, helping us use available resources efficiently and effectively. It will also help sustain a new IRS baseline of resources and avoid immediate funding cliffs that would dramatically degrade our ability in many different areas, including the service improvements taxpayers saw this filing season. Chairman Joyce, Ranking Members Hoyer and DeLauro, and members of the subcommittee, that concludes my statement. I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. And quite timely, right there, just at 5:29. So we'll start in questions. We'll take 5 minutes. When you see the yellow light come on, you'll have 1 minute left. So the questions and answers need to be done within that. I'll recognize myself first. Commissioner Werfel, the Inflation Reduction Act required the IRS to study the feasibility of creating a free e-filing tool for taxpayers to file their federal tax returns. The IRS completed the study in May 2023 and shortly thereafter created a pilot called Direct File, rolling it out in 12 states for those making less than $75,000 a year. The IRA mandated that the IRS study the feasibility of creating a free e-filing system. Under what authority did the IRS create the Direct File system?
Congressman, I have two answers to that. First, the small-scale pilot, we believe, is part of a study of whether a solution like that could be deployed nationally. So we wanted to not just study in the abstract, we wanted to actually engage in taxpayers, see if the prototype could be built and could work. So part of the authority was the IRA requirement for a study. But the second authority is under Section 7803 of the code, which requires the commissioner and the IRS to administer the tax code in a way that serves taxpayers, meets the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and we believe provides options for how they file. Just as when we went from paper filing to put, for example, PDF forms online with fillable entries. We didn't believe we needed authority then because we think there's a general authority for the IRS to move and evolve along with technology in the digital age to meet taxpayers and not need for any adjustments that we make to ask Congress for specific authority for all of these adjustments.
What distinguishes Direct File from the existing Free File system?
It's really just another option. We want taxpayers, when they have to file, we want to reduce their stress and make the process easier. And one of the things that we've heard from taxpayers and various members of Congress is that an option where a taxpayer could file online for free direct with the IRS versus working with a software provider is an option that should be available. We encourage taxpayers to work to figure out what is the best option for them. And we know that many taxpayers have enjoyed and are satisfied with the commercial software they use, and they are free to continue to use that software. But there are taxpayers, and I've heard directly from them, that we're looking for another option. And what we're doing is testing whether we could provide such an option and whether there was a demand for it.
Well, the IRS spent over $24.6 million on creating the Direct File pilot, and only 140,000 Direct File tax returns were successfully submitted. You're promoting this as a success, but less than 1% of the 19 million taxpayers eligible for Direct File submitted a successful return. The IRS spent $174 per return when the Free File system exists. As chairman of the subcommittee, I look at wasteful spending, sir. Commissioner Werfel, why didn't the IRS encourage taxpayers to use existing Free File system instead of creating a duplicative system and spending $24.6 million on it?
Well, this is the exact type of debate we were hoping to have once we run the pilot and reported our results. There's a lot of different ways to look at the demand in the 140,000 taxpayers. We opened it up to the public in early March, so we didn't have the full filing season. I believe that if we were open for the full filing season, the numbers likely would have been higher because many of the eligible taxpayers filed before we opened it to them. Also, we saw a significant ramp in demand over the course of filing season. So by the time we got to April 13th, 14th, we were seeing exponential growth. And I think that's because more people, as they started to focus on their taxes, looked at this option favorably. And in terms of the cost per return filed, a lot of what was built this year, if we were to go forward, has already been built. So we would expect that the cost per return will drop significantly in the future if Direct File goes forward. But we're glad that people are having this debate. We're glad that there can be an analysis and cost information out there to analyze the go forward.
Well, the IRS included $75 million in our fiscal year 2025 budget request for Direct File, but we've heard that you may not go forward.
Correct.
Who at the IRS will determine if Direct File continues?
Yeah, we hope to make a decision fairly soon. We released a 40 to 50 page report detailing all of the findings from the pilot last week. We're now doing a variety of stakeholder engagement with all kinds of taxpayers and taxpayer intermediaries. I hope that over the next several weeks, we will complete that and be able to make and announce a decision.
Thank you. And I recognize Ranking Member Hoyer for any questions he may have.
Thank you very much. Let me start with a basic question. Let me start with a basic question. I've been on this subcommittee for a long time. And that is, how much revenue that is owed to the federal government under the laws that we have passed, not being paid because of a lack of enforcement, which is both a direct loss and an indirect loss. A direct loss by the money we don't, and an indirect cost by people who believe that they're not going to be checked anyway, so they will either go very close to the line or over the line.
Congressman, we refer to that as the tax gap. It's the difference between the balance owed versus the balance paid, and we estimate it to be $687 billion a year.
$687 billion
Yes,
per year.
per year.
Does the current request of the administration anticipate, with the enforcement money that you have from IRA and that are requested, will that make a significant dent in that gap?
We believe it will. We had at the point of the Inflation Reduction Act, right, the day before it was enacted, the most anemic audit rates that we've had, essentially in IRS history. Now, what we're doing with these funds is increasing our ability to enforce, in particular, on high wealth and complex filers. One reflection that I've shared before is on the day the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, we had one auditor for every 150 of the top tier most wealthy taxpayers in the country. I'm not talking about just like 10 million or more in income or assets. I'm talking about 250 million, the topmost tier. So one auditor for each 250. Many of these tax returns are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages long. So I told people to picture that one auditor like backing in trucks and trucks full of tax returns, and it's them against that, all of that. And what we need to do is not only hire more people, but provide them technology, data analytics, and subject matter expertise to unpack all that complexity. We are leaving a lot of money on the table.
The statistic I have, and I showed last year, was that from 2010 to 2019, those fiscal years, IRS audits of millionaires plummeted from approximately 9% plus to less than 0.5%. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Again, I'll make it clear, nobody wants people to pay more taxes than they owe. And we set
neither does
what
the
they owe.
IRS.
But to the extent that they do not pay, somebody has to take up the slack, or we create a debt. And there's great concern about that debt. But when you tell me that there's $687 billion per year estimated to be uncollected that's owed, that is a significant problem. Here's a particular peeve I have I want you to answer very quickly. I hear a lot of advertisements about, on the radio, some on TV, but mostly radio. If you come to us, you haven't paid your taxes, guess what? We'll save you $1,000, $10,000, 50% of what you owe, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to me a great disincentive for people to pay their taxes. Are you concerned about those advertisements?
I am concerned about those advertisements. Many of them are exploiting the complexity of the tax system and stress over taxes to victimize these individuals. And here's why. We have a variety of tools that are very accessible for you to either create an installment agreement or do an offer in compromise. We've designed them so that you shouldn't need help They're very fluid to be able to get. And then you don't have to pay or give any financial risk to anyone who's claiming that they can get the IRS debt to go away. The reality is that we have programs in place. They're very accessible. We're working on making them more accessible. And those that believe they have to work with someone in order to take advantage of these programs are giving something away. That's why these businesses have the money to afford to advertise and to exist. And what we've learned over and over again from testimonials and from talking to taxpayers is at the end of this process, they are left with a mess on their hands. So we urge people to get educated. You're going to work with someone reputable, but really come to the IRS, search free help at irs.gov. There's a lot there that's navigable, and you might not need the help that the marketers are saying you need.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyer. We now recognize former chairman of this committee, but current chairman of Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, Steve Womack.
Go ahead, Mr. Bowman.
Thank you. Commissioner, thank you for being here today. And in my previous role as chairman of the subcommittee, I always enjoyed the fact that you were very responsive to, to the questions that we had, though this is your first hearing before this subcommittee. I got a quick question about taxpayer advocate service, and then I want to pick up on what Mr. Hoyer was talking about just a minute ago. As you're aware, the Taxpayer Advocate Service is an important organization within the IRS that assists American taxpayers who are experiencing financial difficulty, need help solving tax problems, or believe the IRS may not be performing as it should. It's my understanding that the Taxpayer Advocate Service, which my constituents heavily rely on, is struggling to keep up with demand. The fiscal 25 request for TAS is $236 million, but the 24 enacted was $271 million. So does the budget request address the need? Help me understand the difference between the enacted 24 versus the request in 25.
Yeah, there are choices that we need to make in terms of how we maximize the effect of the discretionary request we have of $12.3 billion. We can also provide supplemental resources to the taxpayer advocate using Inflation Reduction Act dollars to help close gaps. Anything that you see in the 25 budget, we are using Inflation Reduction Act to try to meet the demand. We don't always get all the way there. So we will work with the taxpayer advocate to help them manage demand. I mean, typically the better job we do with service, the less their phone rings. And so we can try to reduce some of the demand by improving our customer service, our ability to resolve taxpayer issues, and we'll also work with the taxpayer advocate to make sure that they are accessing other non-discretionary resources to make sure that especially hardship cases get addressed.
Those IRA funds, though, run out.
They do.
Eventually. 26, correct?
They do. So where we stand today is, for example, we've requested $2.8 billion for taxpayer service dollars coming up in 25. That would get you 25,000 FTE, but we actually need 38,000 FTE to manage the tax system. And that's just the number of phone calls, tens of millions of phone calls, the hundreds of thousands of people that come into our walk-in centers, all the paper that comes in that needs to be managed. So we are using IRA resources to close that gap, to get to that 38,000 FTE so that we can meet the taxpayer demand. But that IRA money runs out. It runs out in 26, and then we will have to shrink our customer service, and you'll see those lines start to emerge again at our walk-in centers and on the phones.
Yeah, and the $687 billion tax gap, first of all, I'm not sure how you calculate that. I'm sure you've got high-speed computers and experts that can, I mean, that's not a round number. That's $687 billion.
Yeah.
How much of that is owed by people, say, making less than $400,000 a year, which would account for the majority of tax filers, would be my guess?
Yeah, no, there is and I don't have that number at my fingertips, but as you can imagine, across that $687 billion portfolio, you have distributions of income. We have people that aren't paying their balance due at the low income end of the register and those at the high income. What we have set out as a plan is to increase our capacity and our scrutiny on high wealth filers, because that's where we fell the most behind during the lean years prior to the Inflation Reduction Act. We didn't lose as much capacity to assess balance due for simple filers, but we lost a ton of capacity because large corporations are operating in more tax jurisdictions. They're using alternative currencies. They're using more sophisticated methods. In some cases, not in all, we have CFOs and CEOs that are doing the right thing, but too often CEOs and CFOs that are not, and they are using sophisticated methods to shield their income. So the idea around the Inflation Reduction Act spend is to make sure we're investing where we need it the most. And where we need it the most is where we fell behind the most. And where we fell behind the most is complex filers.
I know I'm out of time. I want to pick up on something that Mr. Hoyer said a minute ago, just as a statement for the record, and that is, and I'm not going to pick on Optima necessarily, although their marketing's pretty good because that's the one I remember. But I too am concerned, and I've voiced this concern in this subcommittee before, that when you are driving down the road, listening to a sports broadcast, and you hear somebody come on and says, hey, if you owe the IRS, you're in good luck, call us, and we're gonna give you all this relief. And I just scratch my head thinking, wait a minute, I don't owe the IRS because I paid my taxes. And so why should somebody else get off the hook? So I've always had a little bit of concern about that. And then the last thing, and this would just be for a quick response. You know, in recent years, we've seen a lot of indications of identity theft, stolen numbers, those kinds of things, people stealing and filing false claims and what have you. In your modernization effort, has that tamped down somewhat? Real quickly, because I'm out of time.
Yes, it has. We are doing a more effective job year over year in avoiding identity theft situations. Where we have work to do is once you've been victimized, the line is too long to get help from the IRS, and that's something we're focused on fixing.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Womack. Ranking Member DeLauro. Love to hear your question.
Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you. Just a couple of points about the recent conversation here. Throughout the appropriation process, House Republicans have sought to destroy the funding for the IRS. It's been more than $21.6 billion in cuts to IRS funding over the past year. We've heard about the tax gap, $687 billion. You have been able to collect $520 million in back taxes, estimated 1,000 millionaires, billionaires, which is collecting revenue. I just wanted to repeat for the record, collecting revenue legally owed. Now, and again, with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they frame our debt as a problem of investments in the American people. We have a revenue problem, which I think that we have demonstrated here this morning, and there is a refusal to let the IRS collect legally owed taxes from billionaires, corporate folks, in order to address the problem. So it's just very, very quickly. We're going into a new budget year. If more funding is cut from your budget, what would that mean?
Well, what it'll mean,
What are the consequences?
the consequences is we will not be able to meet the demand that taxpayers present. People will call the IRS and not get through. That'll happen to more people. People will show up at our walk-in centers. They'll find long lines and not be able to get in. And we will be limited in our ability to hold people accountable that aren't playing by the rules. And this is why this is so important. If you are a CFO of a large company and you're playing by the rules, you want an IRS that, first of all, leaves you alone, doesn't select you for audit because we've invested and now have the precision to see where the evasion is more likely. And once we pull the return of where we think the evasion is more likely, The CFO that's doing the right thing wants to make sure we're holding the CFO that's not playing by the rules accountable. All of that degrades if we don't meet the resources that we need.
Yeah, and those consequences need to be telegraphed loud and clear, and about who, from whom are we trying to get the owed taxes from. 55 corporations, 0 in federal taxes, another 39 who pay only a portion of their taxes. Let me move to the child tax credit. What an amazing success, and I put you at the IRS at the center of making this program an enormous success. You distributed nearly $93 billion in monthly child tax credit payments to families. And as I mentioned earlier, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration found the IRS accurately sent 98% of monthly child tax credit payments. No fraud, waste, abuse, people not going to work, people buying drugs with a child tax credit, all of that naysaying dissipated with the success that you and the staff have had in making that possible. I also might add at this juncture that distributed nearly $93 billion. I have folks who tell me, my God, we really can't afford a child tax credit that lift, almost half the kids in this country out of poverty, lowered the hunger rate. We can't afford it. But by God, we certainly can afford a $687 billion tax gap. We could deal with the child tax credit over and over again. Should the monthly child tax credit be reinstated, how quickly would the IRS be able to restart the program, and how can the Congress assist in this effort? And can you just briefly discuss the lessons learned from the child tax credit implementation, how it's impacted other IRS programs?
Yeah, Congressman, first of all, I really appreciate you expressing your appreciation. The IRS workforce often does rise to the challenge, and in particular during COVID, really did a lot of heroic efforts to send out lifeline economic payments to so many hundreds of millions of Americans, and credit to my predecessor and others who led the IRS through that period. What's also important, and what a huge lesson learned is that we are starting to make advances in updating our core technology. And I've heard for a long time that a lot of money has been spent, but has the IRS technology improved? I can report that it is starting to show meaningful improvement. And it's for that reason that if a child tax credit new program was enacted, we could re-engineer and begin within weeks, not months. And that is because A, we've done it before, and so now we have the playbook, but B, we've made not all the advances we need. We have a long way to go on technology, but changes have started to happen, and we are starting to see those technological changes generate efficiency, like weeks, not months, to move forward on a new child tax credit program.
Well, get ready, because we are going to reinstate the child tax credit. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. DeLauro. We now recognize Chairman Amadei.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
Yeah, I've been told that tax collections over the last couple years, are at record levels. Do I have accurate information, or what can you tell me about collections in general over the last couple of tax seasons?
Well, I'd say that the size of the tax base has grown. So we're seeing the population grow, and there's more taxpayers. So just in the general rhythm of collecting taxes, the receipts can ebb and flow. But as the population grows and as the economy grows, we can see higher overall receipts and higher overall collections. But it's the audits that haven't grown in the way they should. And that's why in my testimony, I outlined plans to increase the audit rates.
I get that, but is the answer to my question, are dollars up the last couple cycles?
I would have to double check, but I do believe overall receipts are increasing as the population grows and as the economy grows.
And if I heard you right, part of a function of that, in your view, is birth rates. Because more people are attaining adult status and filing, or Not that
Well,
you necessarily have to
over
be
the
an adult.
2010s, we saw a 7% increase in the number of tax filers. So just to give you a kind of a rough benchmark, in the 10 years between 2010 and roughly 2020, about a 7% growth in filings.
But what do we attribute that to?
Population growth.
Okay. Also, we've heard talk about technology and funding for technology and stuff like that. Can you kind of briefly tell us what those technology advances have done, if anything,
Yeah.
to affect the workforce that you need to prosecute your core missions?
Oh, absolutely. When I was answering Congresswoman DeLauro, I left out the importance of not just our phone lines and our walk-in centers, but our digital solutions. And, we have an emerging generation of taxpayers that are used to doing everything from their smartphone and tablets, and we need to get there. So one of the things that has happened in the last few years is we've made dramatic increases to our digital solutions. You can now get an individual online account, a business online account. Their functionalities in those accounts are increasing so that more and more, you don't have to walk in, you don't have to call us, but if you have business with the IRS, you can do it from your smartphone or your tablet or your laptop. We've made more changes to irs.gov in the last 2 years than in the previous 20 years combined, and that's but we have a lot more to do. Because the gap between, for example, your favorite online bank and what they can do and what we can do is significant. And we plan to use the Inflation Reduction Act funds to close the gap so that your children and grandchildren are operating in a world where they never have to call or walk into an IRS center.
So connect the dots for me, if you will, in whatever context is appropriate. The technology advances have affected what it costs us to operate the company. How? Have we gotten any efficiencies and cost reductions in operating the company from the technology, or?
Absolutely have. Yeah, we absolutely have seen efficiency. Every time we move a form from paper to digital, we've seen a lot more digital upload of documents. We're up to the point now where 94% of Americans can send stuff to us electronically rather than have to use paper. The reduction of paper reduces costs. The issue is that the tax system grows at a faster rate than we can drive efficiency. And I'll give you a good example of that. The Congress passed a law requiring the IRS to build a new technology to do information reporting for digital currency. So there's a whole new program out there because of digital currency that we now have to create new infrastructure. So we have a new cost because we have to build a new system because there's new currencies. That system has to be both built and maintained. So even though we may be driving efficiencies in these legacy systems that are in place, making them more efficient, when Congress changes the code and adds new requirements, our overall resource base grows.
Last question. Some members have referred to, with specific numbers, corporations. X number of corporations pay whatever, X number. Can you tell me what, if anything, you're doing, if it's finite, what are you doing to prioritize going and getting those 55 or whatever with your existing assets? I would assume that if that information's out there and they're not paying their fair share, that you've got a top 10 list or something where it's like, we're going after A, B, C, and D because they're at the top of the list.
We absolutely do. In fact, we have a top 1,600 list, 1,600 millionaires and billionaires that owe back taxes. We have 125.
So are they, tell me.
Yeah, we're
real
collecting
briefly.
from them. They've heard from us. We've collected 500 million so far and more to go. We've sent letters to 125,000 wealthy individuals who haven't filed since 2017, and they're hearing from us. We've
Is
launched
that data available from you? Is that public information?
public information.
Good. Thank you. My
Okay.
time has expired, so I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pocan?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner. So how much was it again to create the direct file system?
It was 26.4 million of IRS funds.
26?
24.6.
24.6, okay. And do you know how much is made by the tax preparation industry annually?
I don't have that number, but I know it's in the billions.
I looked up one company, Intuit, 14.3 billion. They had a 13% increase. H&R, 35 billion. It's big money. Their lobbying alone was $93 million, which is almost 4 times what it cost completely to create the direct file system. That would save taxpayers an enormous amount of money if more people would have access to direct file. Isn't that correct?
It could, and we want free file to expand. We think one of the things about the free file program is not enough people are taking advantage of it. And this past filing season, we saw an 11% increase in free file. Some of it direct file, some of it free file with the software providers. We're happy about that.
And what can we do to do that? Because I know one stat, and I've heard a couple today, so I'm not sure if this is correct, but 70% of people would qualify for the direct file, but like 3% use. What can we do to get more people to be able to have that information?
You know, it's just like when we were talking earlier about people getting scammed by too good to be true advertising. We have to do more outreach, and we plan on doing a lot more outreach. And one of the questions earlier was, are you getting more efficient? And we are. What do we want to do with new capacity? There's more help that's needed in underserved populations. We had 7 million taxpayers last year eligible for EITC that didn't claim it. We need to close that gap. And in working in underserved and distressed communities, we can share more information about tax scams, what to be on the lookout for, and what are free options for you to file. And we want them to have choice. We want them to be educated to know, well, I can file for free with the IRS direct, or I can use a commercial software. Let me try both and see what works for me. The idea around direct file is really another option with the overall objective of serving people that can't afford an accountant and need more help.
Well, and we require people to pay taxes, so the fact that we would provide something for them to do that only makes complete sense to me. And to that, you talked about the money that doesn't get to low-income families. I think $12 billion in tax credits they think are left on the table. Is there a way to auto-file some of that information with this system so that when people, if they do direct file, some of that could be included since you receive it electronically?
There is a lot of study that we need to do to understand the future of tax filing. Right now, where we stand today, it is up to you to enter your information, and you are the final arbiter of what your tax return is. There are other countries, other nations that do it very different. They present, you're still the final arbiter, but they present to you a completed tax return, and you thumbs up and thumbs down. Whether the U.S. goes in that direction, I think it's a valuable conversation to have. My commitment is to be transparent, so that if we're going to move in a direction where we're providing more information to the taxpayer to react to versus them putting it in themselves, I'm going to share that information publicly before we go forward.
Are you looking at maybe doing that with part of this pilot?
I think we should have conversations with stakeholders. If we move forward with direct file next filing season, what should we adjust to further reduce taxpayer stress? What should, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah. Also, on the private companies, there was all the information about data got shared with Meta, which I don't think, here we are, multiple bills to fight TikTok and other companies who are doing things with privacy and data, and we see this industry sharing data in a very disturbing way. We don't share data with anyone, do we?
We don't, and this is what's interesting about taxpayers. They have different preferences, right? And different experiences. One of the notable things that we learned in the direct file pilot was more than 85% of taxpayers that use direct file said it increased their trust of the IRS. There are taxpayers out there who are not going to want to use direct file, who have a different trust relationship with us, and they can use commercial software. The issue is taxpayer choice.
Yeah, and I guess I would just end with, we would love to have that taxpayer choice in Wisconsin. So if you are looking at expanding, I noticed the only Midwestern state you had is South Dakota, which is a relatively small sample. Upper Midwest would certainly love to be included, or at least Wisconsin. I'll speak for Wisconsin. And if you could do that, we would really appreciate it, because I'd love to save my constituents money. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pocan. We recognize Mr. Molnar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Werfel, just last Friday, Treasury issued a final rule on the 30D tax credit, which included relaxing restrictions on sourcing graphite from China. And as you may know, the People's Republic of China passed new critical mineral export controls last October, which allow the PRC to restrict graphite exports to any country for supposed national security reasons. There is clear evidence that these restrictions are already happening. Last June, European battery manufacturers were unable to source graphite from the PRC, causing negative repercussions for battery production in Europe. That's according to the European Commission. Commissioner, do you believe the tax dollars of hardworking Americans should be given to foreign entities of concern or their U.S. subsidies?
We have a responsibility at the IRS to work to find the right outcome. Treasury ultimately has the final discretion on what a notice or a final rule will indicate. I know, just based on the fact that we get a lot of public comment and a lot of differing opinions on how we construct a reg, what kind of outcomes it will have. I think it's a healthy dialogue to have. I think ultimately what our responsibility is at the IRS is to make sure that we're carrying out the laws dispassionately and on an evidence base, and that's what we try to do.
So if I understand what you're saying is you feel that that's Treasury's responsibility to determine whether, hardworking taxpayer dollars should be given to foreign entities of concern or their U.S. subsidiaries, not the IRS's.
What I know is that with respect to the clean vehicle credit and other provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act related to energy, the reg writing process has generated a multitude of different perspectives and opinions, a very healthy dialogue on the policy and operational tensions involved in the final reg. Ultimately, it's up to Treasury to calibrate all those tensions and come up with an outcome that best serves the intent of the law.
So you don't want to share an opinion on whether, we should be giving American taxpayer dollars to entities from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea?
I think the intent of the law is to curb any financial benefit of foreign entities of concern. And I am all about supporting the intent of that law. I think ultimately there's a variety of different paths you can take to meet that objective, and Treasury has the final say on what path we take.
Can you tell me what statutory authority you believe gives you the ability to create an impractical to trace safe harbor, a category of constituent material, or a category of battery material, absolutely none of which are remotely contemplated in the 30D statute as amended by the IRA?
That question I'm going to have to get back to you on to understand from Treasury General Counsel and Office of Tax Policy what legislative authorities they've relied on for reaching any conclusions under that regulation.
Okay, and I would welcome any a letter or some communication from your general counsel to just establish the likelihood that these provisions would even withstand legal challenge by a taxpayer.
I can commit to that.
Thank you. Are there any restrictions under current law that would prevent a subsidiary of a foreign entity of concern that receives IRA tax credits from sending those payments back to its parent company in a hostile foreign nation?
Again, I will have to get back to you on the steps that are being taken to mitigate the type of risk that you describe. But again, I'm not familiar with the exact details of that, so I'll have to get back to you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any measures that you intend to implement to ensure that taxpayer funds are not directed to such entities, considering the broader implications for national security and economic independence?
Yes, I mean, now you've hit on the responsibility that the IRS has, is once the decisions are made in terms of the parameters, the guardrails, the what is legal and what is not from a regulatory standpoint, then the IRS has to stand up the infrastructure, including the fraud detection, the program integrity issues, and therefore we will build what I call a risk register to understand what are the top issues that will degrade the integrity of the program and the intent of the law and the regulation, and we'll use data science and other elements to try to make sure that we have leading indicators to see where behavior is going in a direction that we need to step in and prevent it. And so in the future, as we move forward to implement final regs, I'd be happy to brief you on some of the program integrity things that we're doing to address.
Do you have any idea on timing on that?
Not at my fingertips, but I can get back to you on proposed time.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Molnar. We'll now recognize Mr. Bishop for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Werfel, thank you for your testimony, for being here, and let me thank you and your team for your hard work and doing so much with limited resources. There's been a lot of discussion this morning about the tax gap, and it's my understanding that between 2010 and 2022, the number of examining revenue agents who handle complex enforcement cases fell by 40%. That the field collection revenue officers who manage the difficult collection cases dropped by 54%. Can you tell me how the loss of so many highly trained enforcement staff are vital to ensuring the integrity of the tax code? How has that prevented IRS from addressing the tax gap and generating the much-needed revenue to reduce the deficit and pay for other priorities? That's my first question. And I have two other questions that are relatively short, so you can take short answers. One is what the IRS is doing and what efforts you're deploying with regard to artificial intelligence to crack down on tax evasion, and whether or not you're developing artificial intelligence tools in-house, or are you collaborating with outside experts or contractors? And the final question is relative to rural taxpayers. Many of my constituents live in rural areas, and they don't have access to high-speed internet. So when they file their returns, they do so by paper rather than online. And what is IRS doing to speed up the processing of the paper returns?
Thank you, Congressman. Let me start with your first question, which is underfunding means two things. It means we don't have the right number of people, we're not right-sized, so that therefore we don't have the scope and the reach that are necessary to address tax evasion where it's happening. And the second thing is we're not making the right investments in subject matter expertise and in analytics, including AI, to make sure that we are unpacking the complexity. We are finding the right taxpayers to audit and leaving the taxpayers that are playing by the rules alone. It degrades both our scale and our depth of knowledge, and it means that that more evasion will occur, and that will create uncertainty in markets and be very challenging for those companies and partnerships that are playing by the rules and expects the IRS to hold people accountable to play by the rules. Your second question, just bridging on the AI, how are we using AI in enforcement? You know, the analogy that I'll use is a chess game. When we are looking to select audit amongst some of the largest corporations in the world, those that aren't playing by the rules are shielding their income in very sophisticated ways. An example might be they're operating in multiple tax jurisdictions. They're doing a significant amount in the US, but they're moving all of that economic activity as they're presenting it to a better tax rate jurisdiction, when the reality is that activity is happening in the US. How do we detect that? That's a chess move by them. And what we're deciding to do is rather than just have the human there playing that chess game, we're getting the computer to advise us. It's still the human's decision. It's the IRS employee's decision on what the next move should be, but we're having the computer help us calculate all the permutations of the moves so that we're better at the chess board and can catch the evasion more effectively.
In-house or outside?
Both. We have important partnerships with the private sector, but ultimately, decisions on audit selection is inherently governmental, and only IRS employees make those decisions.
And the rule?
Rule, yeah, I mean, this is a really important
Paper
point.
filing?
Yeah, we have done significant improvements in managing our paper backlogs. They were significantly outsized during COVID, and now they're back all within what I call tolerance, with the exception of the employee retention credit, which is a different thing. So, and a different challenge. But more work is needed, and what we really want to see is increased access to high-speed internet all over the country so that those taxpayers can avail themselves. But we will meet them where they are. And if they have to file in paper, we will do better in paper. And also, we will set up, and we've been doing this more and more, walk-in centers. We call them pop-up walk-in centers, where we are going to rural communities that are more than 100 miles from a city center and setting up shop with a walk-in center so they can get help if they need it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Recognize Mrs. Henson now for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being before us today to discuss your budget request. As I'm sure you'd agree, based on your testimony, federal agencies, including the IRS, are in the business of customer service, which is crucial that our taxpayers get that high level of support. It should be the top priority. And as you mentioned, millions of Americans are interacting with you through the annual filing season. So it is critical that they are able to receive those timely responses and get the feedback and returns that are rightfully owed to them. As I say to Iowans, it's their money, not the government's money, right? So throughout the past filing season, my team has been hearing from constituents who are concerned they cannot go to their local IRS office in person to pick up their tax forms or filing instructions. And I think a lot of that is due to in-person work challenges. And you noted in a House Ways and Means hearing earlier this year, roughly 50% of IRS personnel are in the office at any given time. So do you believe that this is still the case, that it's about half? And how are you tracking how many employees are currently in their offices to do those services, like you mentioned, pop-up offices as well?
Yeah, so there's tens of thousands of IRS employees that are always on site. These are people that are, for example, managing the paper that's coming in and doing submission processing, but it's also our employees in our walk-in centers. There is no remote work in any of our walk-in centers around the country. We have, since the start of the Inflation Reduction Act, reopened or opened more than 50 walk-in centers around the country. They're
Are
virtually
those being staffed every day, though?
fully staffed every day. Here's the challenge that we see. We move to an appointment schedule during the week, and we have more taxpayers coming than we can handle in a lot of cases because everyone else has an appointment. So we started opening Saturday hours, and that's not by appointment. And sometimes, and a given walk-in center can serve about 300 people a day on a Saturday without appointment, but sometimes 400 or 500 people show up. And this is why it's so important that we continue to make sure that we're right-sizing our footprint to meet the demand. So if we can serve 300 people in a city center in Iowa, and 500 people are showing up, that tells me there's more people that are needed, and we need to improve our digital solutions as well. But in the walk-in centers, those are no one works from home, and they are fully staffed right now.
Well, I would just urge you to continue to keep an eye on that, because if that demand exists, we need to be responsive to that, number one.
Absolutely.
Because I get a district report every single week from my casework team, and it's never less than 2 to 1 in terms of agency interactions. IRS is number one that our casework team has to deal with. So when I look at reports out from GAO, 61% of IRS responses to mailed taxpayer inquiries were considered late. I'd like to see that number improve. That's up from 55% in the previous filing season. So I guess, what are you doing on the staff front when you mention these tens of thousands of employees that are in the office? What are you doing to speed up that correspondence and make sure that's timely?
Yeah, so if you look at our filing season, I look at it as a balanced scorecard. There were places where we exceeded our goals and did terrific. For example, our 1-800-1040 line, we exceeded almost all of our goals. But there are other parts of the IRS operations where we were below goal, and we have more work to do. One of them I mentioned earlier is our response to those that have been victimized by identity theft. The line is too long. People are waiting too long to get their issues resolved. And there are certain correspondences or activities that are not going in the right direction in terms of timeliness. So what we'll do, and what we're doing now that filing season is done, is we're looking at that balanced scorecard, and I'm requiring the team to incrementally improve all the metrics where we fell behind. So I'm always going to be transparent. Like, we had a great filing season, but it wasn't perfect. And when it's not perfect, that is impacting a taxpayer. That means a taxpayer couldn't get through or got something late, and that matters to us. I don't know that we can ever be perfect. That would be unrealistic. But we're going to continue to perfect our process and not rest. I like to say there's no victory laps here. We had a good filing season, a strong filing season. We need to build on it, but we also have to close gaps.
Yeah, no, I certainly understand that. And closing gaps, you know, you mentioned your phone wait times are down significantly, but we're still hearing reports from people who are waiting for 45 minutes. And so if you're calculating that average by including people who hang up, of course that number's going to be
No,
lower.
I can
But
explain
the
that, actually.
45 minutes is way too long to wait. Nobody has
Agreed,
that much time.
and I can explain that, which is our main line, our 1040 line, almost 90% of every call the IRS gets comes through that phone line. So we really focused on that. That is the line that has a 3-minute wait. That is a line that we had the best level of service we've ever had this year in terms of us successfully answering those calls and those questions. The remaining 10% are the other call lines that we have. We have to do better. If you hear someone that had a 45-minute wait, guaranteed that is in one of those other call lines in the remaining 10%. We got to close those gaps.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to following up with you on that. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hanson. Now recognize Ms. Torres for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here. Former President Trump's 2017 tax scam was the biggest tax increase to middle-class property owners through the use of SALT. How SALT worked for folks that may not know how it worked. Property owners agreed to tax themselves or to pay for public bonds to build libraries, police stations, maybe a bridge, and local infrastructure. And in exchange, they would be able to use that money and to take a deduction on their taxes based on that. It has had a significant impact on California property owners. It has had a significant impact on property owners in states where this was practiced. It was not a free gift to those property owners. It was an investment that they made in the communities. Most of those communities, the federal government has failed to provide proper funding for housing and for all of those things that they chose to tax themselves on. I'm interested in hearing what you are hearing from our taxpayers, how they have been impacted by this, and is there anything that you can help with to alleviate SALT?
So the role that I have as IRS Commissioner is to make sure that I understand what the experienced taxpayers are having with the law on the books in terms of getting the questions answered from the IRS, getting the forms they need.
Part of that experience includes how they are experiencing changes in laws, and that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and that is actually something that's more in Secretary Yellen and her team's wheelhouse.
Okay.
So any concern, the concern that Congressman Molinar raised on the clean vehicle credit and these concerns, I will bring back to the Treasury Department and make sure that we provide fulsome answers.
So let me go to the IRS audit of the working poor.
Yes.
Which has been covered by so many of my colleagues already. It is really unsettling to see the audit numbers, and I know that you have stated here that you are working to improve those numbers. So how is that going to be a realistic approach that my community, who is often first on the block, priority? I want to make sure that you're focusing on tax cheats and that you're not focusing on the people that are doing everything that they can to pay their taxes.
Yeah. When I arrived in the IRS in March of '23, we began as a team to look at the audit rates, in particular in low-income communities. There is a lot of inequity that has existed in terms of how audits are decided upon, and we are working to both acknowledge that inequity and change it. So
And part of that involves ensuring that you have a diverse workforce.
Yes.
So that they are, have some cultural competency and income competency, and that are not simply going after the lowest, the easy picking.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we have, in response to these concerns, on these equity concerns, have worked with groups that are involved in these equity issues, external stakeholders. Treasury has committees. We have committees. We've created separate working groups just to look at equity issues in tax administration. And we've already taken steps. For example, I've announced a dramatic reduction in the number of audits related to the earned income tax credit because we believe that that will do two things: address inequity by substantially reducing the volume of those audits, but actually put that audit resource to better use and move it to areas of the tax gap that are more concerning.
Let me go to another issue that is critically important, and that is nonprofit tax compliance with nonprofit agencies. I have seen in my own home city, Pomona, the Fairplex abuse of its tax-exempt status. The report by the California State Auditor revealed that the executive director or the three top executives were making over $10 million a year. At that time, I had requested an audit from the IRS. You did your due diligence instead of, giving them, a large fine. You forced them to make some changes. How are we making sure now that nonprofit agencies are exercising some, good models in how they pay their executive team versus the services that they are providing in the community?
Yeah, and obviously without commenting on any specific case, we take our review of exempt organizations very seriously. Over the last 15 years, I would say, dating back to, the last 10 or 11 years, there have been significant efforts to increase the robustness, the transparency of our approach. We've had our Inspector General, the TIGTA, review our approach on review of exempt organizations, and for the most part, we've gotten good and passing grades from them. That doesn't mean the work is done. We have the ability to continue to understand from congresspeople like you and others where are there activities going on in our EO review process that are leading to bad results. Either someone is not found to be exempt that should have been, or someone is found to be exempt that should not be exempt, and ongoing activities. And we're open to that
My
feedback.
time has expired, and I'd love to continue this conversation with you at another time. I apologize to you.
No problem, Ms. Torres. Now recognize Mr. Cloud for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for spending some time with us today. One of the many grievances in the Declaration of Independence against the King of Great Britain was that he has erected multitude of new offices and sent hither the swarms of officers to harass our people and eat their substance. A lot of the American people feel that way about our government right now, and a lot of that's on Congress, obviously, because no matter how much money we bring in, we spend more and we don't do it in necessarily the most efficient and effective way. Some of that is on the IRS and its long history of weaponization, whether targeting conservative groups, bringing extra scrutiny against them, silencing whistleblowers who spoke up about corrupt efforts to shield Hunter Biden from prosecution, many other activities along those lines. And I'm wondering what the IRS is doing to clean up the culture that has long existed that needs to be directed. I'll just give you an example. There's a letter to Christians Engaged a couple years ago in which it was said, this is part of the letter that the IRS wrote to them denying their 501c3 status. It said, you educate believers on national issues that are central to their belief in the Bible as an inerrant word of God. Specifically, you educate Christians on what the Bible says in areas where they can be instrumental, including areas of sanctity of life, the definition of marriage, biblical justice, freedom of speech, defense, borders and immigration, U.S. and Israel relations. These Bible teachings are typically affiliated with the Republican Party and candidates. This disqualifies you from exemption under the IRS Section 501c3. And while part of me is Republican, wants to give them a medal for their candor and honesty about our policy set, The other part of it is very concerned that this kind of culture existed. Now, the IRS, after Congress pushed back on this, number of members pushed back on this, ended up rescinding this, and they ended up getting their 501c3 status. But the person, for example, their signature line was Stephen Martin. Does he still work at the IRS?
Congressman, I'm not going to comment on any specific matter or on the status of any employee in a public setting.
Was there any disciplinary action taken toward this?
I would have to look into that specific matter and get back to you.
Okay. The rules of the Internal Revenue Service explicitly prohibit 501c3 and 501c4 nonprofits from engaging in planned activities that violate law or induce the commission of a crime. That goes on, the IRS revised Rule 75-384 states explicitly that even anti-war protest organizations committed to world peace, if their primary activity is demonstrations in which demonstrators are urged to commit violations of local ordinances and breaches of public order, that they would not qualify for tax-exempt status. Right now, we have a number of protests going across our college campuses that are being sponsored by a number of organizations. Have any letters been sent to these organizations to let them know that their 501c3 status could be in jeopardy?
So let me respond in a couple of different ways. First of all, look, as a person versus a commissioner, I see activities going on. Anytime there's violence, there's hate, it's heartbreaking. I have to divorce from that as the commissioner. I have to do the job as commissioner in a way that I'm following all required procedures. And while I can't comment on specific cases, I will tell you that
Has the IRS sent any letters to let them know that their 501c3 status may be in jeopardy? That's
again,
very simple
that would be a specific
I'm
action.
talking to any organization in general. I have not named any organizations. I'll be happy to because we can, but in a letter. But have any letters been sent? Have any investigations
I
been
will
opened
go back
along these
and
lines?
I will go back and out of an abundance of caution determine whether I can answer that question on the record without violating a 6103 concern.
Okay. Along the lines of Ms. Henson had asked, right now you are telling us basically that if we don't up the IRS budget, that we will see a degradation in services. But yet, just recently, you made the goal of sending 50% workforce back to work, basically to stop teleworking. To me and to most Americans who are footing the bill for this seems pretty unacceptable. I would urge you to get people back to work. My time's almost expired, so we'll have to get to that if questions for the record. But please work on the culture. Can you tell us what you're doing to work on the culture of the IRS?
Yeah, we want the IRS to be an amazing place for people to come and have impact. And the impact is to help people, to reduce the stress they have in filing their
I'm
taxes.
talking about the partisanship.
It's also essential that there's no place for politics in the IRS. And we take numerous steps in our controls, in our training, and we work with oversight entities like our Inspector General to constantly evaluate moments where there's even the perception of politics in the IRS. And if there is, we work to correct it and make sure it never happens again. But I believe fundamentally across the IRS, there is a common understanding that if politics enters what we do, then we are not meeting our mission effectively.
I would agree with that assessment, but I think we have a number of high-profile instances where that has not been the case. So I would love to see specific examples, perhaps in writing, where you have made some efforts to bring accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cloud. Now recognize Mr. Carl for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for joining us today. I know you look forward to this every year, right?
I do.
Okay, good, good. As you know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed in 2017, is set to expire at the end of 2025. With small businesses making up 99.4% of Alabama's businesses, and as a former business owner myself, what impact will this have to my constituents? Small businesses.
The expiration of the TCJA, is that your
Correct.
question? I have not done a kind of an economic assessment of the TCJA. That falls more with the Treasury Department. In terms of whether the expiration of the TCJA leads to administrative implications for small businesses, I'll have to assess that and get back to you.
So you're saying you don't know that if it's going to raise small businesses' taxes or not? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not prepared to provide an analysis of that. That is something that, if I was to provide an analysis of it, I would have to do it in concert, in consultation with the Treasury Department, and I have not run that analysis.
Well, keep in mind, this administration is quote-unquote focused on not raising taxes on anyone making less than $400,000.
That is my
And
understanding.
I'll promise you, out of this 99.4%, there's probably 90% of that is under 400,000 range. It's going to raise taxes. And I think we both review that as a tax increase. Does the IRS have any plans on, provided this 2025 date expires and we have done nothing, does the IRS have a plan to educate and give guidance to these small businesses across the country? Has that already got put into place?
As I said, based on this question, I will go back and make sure that we understand what implications, not from a tax rate standpoint, that's more for Treasury, and I'm happy to work with Treasury and get an answer to your question there. But in terms of the day-to-day interactions that a small business might have with the IRS in filing their taxes and paying an estimated payment and getting a refund, to the extent the expiration of TCJA has an impact on that, I'm asking for your indulgence to go back and review that and then report back to you. Clearly, if there's an impact on small businesses that's material from an administrative standpoint, I want to be on top of that and I want to be supportive.
All due respect, sir, I've sat through many of these meetings and told that I would get the response back and never get a response.
I'll get you your response.
I would appreciate
I'll be different.
that. Well, I like that. I like being different. The IRS hired up. Excuse me? Oh, okay. I do like being a little different. It's okay. The IRS hired up for tax services to help Americans with smoother filing and even walk-in centers. I know you spoke on that briefly. How do you plan to sustain your level of service with the IRS funding expiring for tax services at the end of the year?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we are confronting what we're calling a funding cliff. We can make it right now with the 25 budget as proposed through 2026, and maintain the strong level of service that we've had and work to close some of the gaps where we have some gaps to close. After 2026, we no longer have the funding to maintain the customer service workforce that we have grown to meet this extraordinary demand that we see. So I will be up here making the case, like I am now, that there are some, what I believe to be relatively modest adjustments on a year-over-year basis in terms of funding and transfer authority to help make sure that we can continue to serve taxpayers.
And one last thing, on the way out the door, one of my staff members told me to see if he could get his tax return back. He's been waiting on it, so.
Okay, well,
I know he's one of many, because we get a lot of those phone calls, but thank you for
his
your
refund,
service.
he's waiting on his refund.
Yes, he is. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carl. Now recognize Mr. Edwards for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Werfel, thank you. We probably look as much forward to this as you do. Of the initial $80 billion pay raise to the IRS, your agency allocated $45.6 billion towards enforcement, and you claim that taxpayers under $400,000 would not experience the effects of that increased enforcement. Nonetheless, according to the IRS data book for 2023, it was reported that the IRS proceeded with 495,700 some odd examinations of individuals making less than $500,000. And I'd love to get more granular and share the exact amount for the 400,000 mark and less, but the data book doesn't include that level of specific data. It's using 500,000 as the maximum in the range that I'm referring to. And that's compared to just 21,455 examinations of taxpayers making more than $500,000, resulting in just over $3.6 billion in additional tax. Clearly, American families and individuals earning $400,000 or less are experiencing the brunt of IRS enforcement actions. Would you agree with that?
I would not, Congressman.
And your basis in disagreeing would be?
Because what I've said and what I'm committed to is that taxpayers who earn less than $400,000, there's no change in their likelihood of being audited the day before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed versus the day after. However, if you're high income, if you earn more than $400,000, and the reality is we're really laser focused on much higher levels of income, for those individuals, the audit rate will increase. And I've announced in my testimony today the various cohorts, millionaires, billionaires, large corporations, complex partnerships. We intend to significantly ramp the audit rates between now and 2026. But if you earn less than $400,000, we peg your audit rate back to 2018, which was a historic low, 0.3% year over year. My goal and my intention is that those taxpayers will not see an increase in that 2018 rate.
So maybe you can help me understand the difference in the chart that I've got here that was taken straight from the data book that I referenced a while ago. And I pulled this data directly from your agency's own book. The Inflation Reduction Act seems to have a concentration of audits against the lower and middle-class American people. In fact, it looks like it's not about 95.5% of the audits have been conducted on folks making less than $500,000. And so can you tell us what is the difference between your claim that folks making less than $400,000 are not being targeted and my calculation of the table that I've referenced to?
Yeah, I can explain this. What your table is reflecting is audits that were closed, that were started 2017, 2018, 2019. It takes sometimes months, but often years for an audit to close. And so what you have, for example, is for large corporations, the audit rate, and that for $250 million or more in assets, the audit rate was 8.8% in 2019, and we plan to get it to 22.6%. That won't be reflected in our data book for a few years. So the bars that you are demonstrating are reflecting a pre-Inflation Reduction Act set of audit activity that is kind of closing up now. What has been started since the Inflation Reduction Act and what will play out in future data books is the bar chart will shift dramatically to the right as we ramp up, as I mentioned, from 8.8% to 22.6% for our largest corporations, and from 11% to 16.5% on wealthy individuals, and on and on.
And so are you claiming that the audits prior to 2018 were targeting 95.5% of the returns for folks less than $500,000, but we expect to see that lower after the inflation?
Well, the thing, I think also your data is raw data versus percent audited. So that would be another clarification to make. What I'm suggesting, and I'm happy to brief you separately and get in the details. And by the way, the data book in the future will be listed at 400,000 rather than 500,000 to help with the transparency. What I'm suggesting is that on a probability, you're a small business, you're a middle or low income individual, your probability of audit has not changed. It'll be the same probability that it was in 2018, and it'll be that way for years. And by the way, 2018 is a historically low audit rate. So there should be some degree of comfort in the fact that I am publicly committing to, and there'll be transparency in future data books, that we are not intending to, and I've ordered the team not to, raise that audit rate above that 2018 level. The opposite is true for our higher wealth filers, whereas I've stated publicly the intention, the marching order is to raise those audit rates. Now, this will all be tested in public data that will be available in the future. The issue is that it takes time for these audits to unfold. An audit of a large, complex corporation can take a long time before it's closed out. We will announce, consistent with what we can do under the law, when we send new waves of audits. For example, we announced recently that we sent audit letters to 76 of the largest partnerships in the world. But in terms of when those close out, that'll take some years before they close out.
And so I think I hear you saying, don't trust the data that's reported now. It's
No,
different.
you can trust it. It just calibrate it back to the sweet spot of when these audits were issued is pre-Inflation Reduction Act. That's what I'm saying. It's trustworthy data. I'm saying the timing to assess whether we met the commitment not to increase audit rates on people over 400,000 is happening in real time. It's actually, as I said in my testimony, tax year 23, which we just completed, is the first full tax year post-Inflation Reduction Act. The audits of tax year 23 taxpayers, those people, that's kind of in more in the future than in the past in terms of the schedule for those audits.
I've gone well beyond my time, Mr. Chair. I apologize, but I would appreciate the opportunity to engage with your office further to get a better understanding, because the data that's available to us now
Yes.
says something materially different than what we're hearing would be the implications for folks making less than 400,000.
I will be responsive to Congressman Carl, and I will be responsive to you and get you what you need.
It's been recognized by the ranking member and myself that we have time for round two. I know you're having so much fun here. You want to continue this?
I'm ready.
And I'll start with myself again. The IRS Advisory Council Public Report that was published in November of '23 recommended that the reporting threshold for Form W-2G be increased to $5,000. As you know, the threshold of $1,200 has been a static amount since 1977. In February 2024, I co-signed a letter with several of my appropriations colleagues on this issue. What consideration, Commissioner, have you been given to update the W-2G threshold in accordance with the recommendation of the IRS Advisory Committee?
Yeah, I'm aware of this issue, Congressman. I think it's very valuable when we get input from the taxpaying community and from our advisory council on when thresholds may be out of date. As I've mentioned throughout this hearing, the determination of something like that is of a regulatory nature, and therefore, while they would consult with me, the decision rests with Treasury, the Office of Tax Policy, in consultation with the Secretary. I know that this particular recommendation is under serious consideration, and I can certainly provide you a more detailed update following this hearing.
That'd be great, sir. Another interest I have is in cannabis.
Yes.
And trying to set some regulatory guidelines and fairness there. And when Treasury Secretary Yellen and OMB Director Young testified before the subcommittee in March, we discussed access for cannabis banking. And just last week, this administration announced its plan to recommend reclassifying cannabis from a Schedule I to a Schedule III substance. Today, legal cannabis businesses are unable to utilize the banking system and are barred from certain tax exemptions, forcing businesses to hire armored vehicles to transport their cash to make tax payments to the IRS as well as local offices, creating both logistical and security issues for all involved. Commissioner Werfel, have you seen or have you thought about any improvements to the process of how these legal cannabis businesses pay their taxes? And what are your recommendations to create a safer and less burdensome payment process for these businesses?
Yeah, Congressman, the announcement on the change in status for cannabis is recent, and what we need to do in a moment like this is understand the implications that this change will have on a whole variety of different elements of this part of the economy. As you mentioned, What will their status be with respect to financial institutions? Will they remain mostly a cash-based industry, or will they move into something other than cash? All of these things are important moving pieces for the IRS to determine how this emerging and changing industry is assessed at the right level and paying what they owe. And so there's more work to do. I think based on my reading of some of your comments, you're asking all the right questions in terms of what do we need to anticipate given this change. We shouldn't just sit on our hands. We should be active and looking at what steps we need to take, and we need to interact with this community and make sure we understand and talk to them. I mean, typically when we engage with industries, we find that they're very amenable to discussing and getting a better understanding of clarity of what they're going to be expected to do. Certainty, tax certainty is one of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It's not a good thing if you're operating in ambiguity. It's a stressful enough situation to pay your taxes, but if you have ambiguity. So my commitment is to work with you and this community to understand how this change evolves the industry and make sure we set up the right tax structures for them to operate in.
And wouldn't it be fair to say that if given the opportunity to have banking system involved in this process, it would make life a little bit easier for you? Because you'd be able to have a third party in which you could judge the finances?
Yeah, I mean, I think history has demonstrated that when we get third-party information, 1099 reporting, it drives a lot of integrity and quality control into the system. It reduces the number of uncertainties and variables. It often is helpful for the taxpayer because they're aware of what the IRS has been informed of in terms of income. So in general, yes. With anything, I'm sure there are tensions, paperwork, burden, privacy, all these other issues that will surface. And my job will be to be at the table and explain what the various trade-offs are from a tax administration standpoint.
And I've heard you discuss this with others about trying to make the office as user-friendly as possible. Do you know what, if any, resources are available to legal cannabis business to help navigate their payment and reporting compliance?
Typically what happens when we have an issue like this or an emerging change in an industry, for example, new currencies, new tax credits where people that previously didn't have eligibility now have, like car dealerships, in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, we build a collaboration and engagement. Sometimes we can do FAQs, sometimes we can hold webinars or roundtables. It seems like this is a material change and that's going to impact this industry and likely will warrant that we start building that type of stakeholder engagement.
Great, thank you. I've exceeded my time. Now I would refer to Ranking Member Hoyer.
I'll be glad to yield the chairman as much time as he wants to consume. First of all, Mr. Commissioner, you were appointed by Donald Trump. Is that accurate?
No,
Pardon?
no, I was not appointed by Donald Trump. I was appointed by President Biden.
Okay, excuse me. I got some misinformation. In any event, I'm going to make my point anyway. Mr. Rettig, one of your predecessors, and you essentially have represented a nonpartisan, bipartisan view of the revenue flow of the IRS and the impact on its ability to do the job that has been given to it by the Congress of the United States. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, my predecessor, Commissioner Rettig, was a significant champion for the IRS workforce and for the dollars that we needed to get the job done.
Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Edwards left because I wanted to refer to his chart. And you went up and looked at it?
Yeah, I couldn't see it from here.
What was the time period for that chart? Did anybody recognize it? Did you see anybody?
It talked about the close of audits in 2023, if I recall. And the reality is that because of some audits take months, but many audits, especially complex, take years. So the closeout date is very different than the inception date.
Yeah. My point is, I like that chart. And that chart reflects a reality. that under $400,000, if you have an audit, essentially, on average, it's a 1-to-1. You spend $5 to do and you save $5. You find $5 in fraud or underpayment. If you audit a millionaires, you get 12 times the expense. So you have a 12-to-1. Now, it's interesting that in the last 10 years, we have audited many, many, many more people under 400,000. Why? It's easy. So you can conduct audits. You don't get much money because the payments are relatively small, and because probably 90% of those, I'm just taking that off the top of my head, don't have a figure, have every week, every bi-week, every month, we collect their taxes. It's the corporations, it's the pass-throughs, it's the partnerships, et cetera, that you don't do that with, which are much larger, which is why you have 4, 5, 6, 12-to-1 return on the audit. So I want to see because he makes our point. To the extent you underfund enforcement, and enforcement has been reduced 22% from 2010 to 2019. Hopefully we have more relevant, more recent statistics than that, but has been reduced 22%. Returns are up 7%. That's a 39% difference there, or 29%, excuse me. So it is not surprising that we have that $687 billion underpayment. Why? Not just because it's just the cheats, or strike that, people who don't pay what they're supposed to pay, but it is also because those who know that there's $687 billion owed, they may not ever be caught. So not only our tax system, one of the great things about it is a largely voluntary system, one of the most voluntary in the world. I think we're now at 87% or something like that.
80, yeah.
Is that correct?
Just north of 85%.
85%, in that ballpark. But frankly, to the extent we reduce enforcement, with all due respect to all of us, if we think, well, maybe it's due and maybe it's not, I'm not going to pay it. And if they catch me, and I pay it. That's why this enforcement system is so critically important. It's also not unusual that those who make the most are audited the least. My, isn't it nice that we don't, for all those people who give us all these big contributions and all that sort of stuff, we won't look at you so much. We're going to look at the little guy a lot, which is what that chart showed. Now, I hadn't seen that chart before, and I don't know the basis, so I have to analyze it. But the EITC, I was glad to hear you say, they don't make anything hardly. They're scraping by. They have it tough. And we want to really look at them. Is there fraud in the EITC? There absolutely is. Why is there fraud in the EITC? Because human beings are participating in it. And human beings want to try to pay as little as they have, me included. But some people cheat. And they claim they are who not. You don't collect much from them because they don't have much. But that's why so much time was spent on it, because we want to see that little old lady who's driving the Cadillac coming and doing the food stamps at the grocery store. So, Mr. Chairman, it concerns me that when people who are making a lot of money, and very frankly, I don't know the statistics on Ms. DeLauro's corporations, but if 41 corporations are paying no taxes, my presumption is they're probably doing that legally. And we make the rules, but we complain about it. But if we make the rules and they're following the rules, they don't pay taxes, God bless them. They got smart accountants, smart lawyers. God bless, I hear that, my colleagues say that all the time. I say, okay, did they go to jail? No. Well, then they're obeying the law, our law. And if you don't like the fact they're not paying any, don't let them have the deductions or the look backs or whatever that they're taking. I know I've taken a longer time, but this is a critical issue for defense, for national security. Because that's how we pay for national security, for domestic security, because that's how we pay for it. That's how we pay for the administration of all the government through Mr. Werfel's and his colleagues' efforts. And we need to come to grips with establishing a system where we don't have, forget about what the figure is. Let's say it's only $400 billion. Let's say we're over extrapolating it by $250 billion. If we have a deficit, we need to be collecting everything that is owing, not a nickel more. And on the 400,000 people on the taxes, on the property tax, very frankly, and I come from a high property tax state. Maryland's a rich state. But very frankly, on property taxes, you buy a $2 million home and somebody down the road can't afford a $50,000 home, you want them to subsidize your real estate. Now, that wouldn't be popular in my district, Mr. Chairman. I know that. It's not popular, but I take that position. Because they want the federal government to subsidize what Ms. Doris said they voted for their schools and whatever. God bless them. But don't then look around at the Maryland taxpayer or the Kansas or Iowa taxpayer or even the Ohio taxpayer to subsidize what they decided to spend money on through their property taxes. That won't be popular in my district, but that's the way it is. Mr. Werfel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You got a tough job. We're going to have a markup, and I'm going to work very hard to get the money that we need as Americans, not you, not the IRS employee. We need as Americans to fund a tax system that is fair, which means that everybody pays their fair share. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, Ranking Member Hoyer. And now we recognize Mrs. Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief question, Commissioner. Obviously, the ERC tax credit, in your testimony, you say that there is still a moratorium on processing those claims because of the fraud, the high amount of fraud with that. And I certainly appreciate the efforts there to combat that fraud. But I am working with a lot of concerned business owners who have those claims pending, and those are refunds that they are rightfully owed. Some of them, some of these pending cases are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, so you can imagine when things are tight, it's the difference between what they were planning to do and grow their business and maybe add some jobs or wait on those dollars. So what is the agency's expected timeline, Commissioner, to continue processing those ERC claims?
Well, we're still processing claims received before September 14th, 2023, when the moratorium started. Since the moratorium, we've processed more than $2 billion in claims. It's those that received after September 14th that we are not currently processing.
Do you have a timeline for when you might begin processing those?
I don't have a
Get caught up?
timeline. What I had stated earlier was after filing season, we were going to conduct or during filing season and leading to after filing season, conducting an assessment of our inventory to figure out the best way to proceed. Unfortunately, Congresswoman, there is a lot of ineligible claims in our inventory. And who is suffering for that? The eligible claims. There are small numbers, but hard to find. One of the things that we are doing, and I urge your constituents that may be waiting, we are working with our taxpayer advocate to move to the front of the line, hardship cases, anything that has become more urgent if you believe you're truly eligible. But we've been also urging a lot of taxpayers who may know they're ineligible to withdraw. And we've had almost $400 million in withdrawals since we announced the moratorium. And then we've had voluntary disclosures for those that received the payments and that they knew they were received in error. And that we have $777 million in people who have voluntarily come to us and returned the ineligible credit.
Right, and some of those issues were with outside companies. I know that we're also involved in
Yes, but to
processing
get
that,
to your question, I want to work to make sure that those that have the most urgent need, while we're continuing to sort through what is a very challenging situation, that we address those quickly.
Are you paying interest out on those claims then?
We're required to, yes.
Okay, and do you know what the expected cost is? Because obviously, when we look about giving you more money, we want to make sure that you're as efficient as possible and driving those costs
The
down.
cost of the interest?
Yeah.
It is largely offset by the cost that we save by holding on to the claim longer. So it ends up being budget neutral, the interest costs. I can give you more data on that.
Well, certainly would encourage you not to, hold back as many of these claims as possible.
I'm
We
not,
need to get them
that's not
paid
the
out.
intention.
Nope,
The intention is to find the eligible ones and process them as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Simpson. Mr. Cloud?
Thank you once again, and I have, I think, what is a little more technical, some questions.
Okay.
In January, the IRS announced that the total amount of recoveries from wealthy individuals as a result of the IRA funding was $520 million, and that's about 5% of the $10 billion increase of revenue that CBO projected for FY '23 and '24. Now, part of that, I think, has a huge part to do with CBO's penchant to overinflate the benefits and inflate the cost of anything we're evaluating. I would guess, say, if we had more help, more people, and more time, we could probably get that done. But going back to the issue on the teleworking that we touched on briefly, I wanted to ask you very specifically, earlier this year, you set a goal for employees to be in the office back to just 50% of the time in May. How many days per pay period do you require your DC-based managers, employers covered by collective bargaining agreements to be physically in the office?
Well, it's half. So if there's 10 days in a pay period, it would be 5 days. And so it's, and let me also offer that what we are requiring is consistency with the government-wide standard issued by the Office of Management and Budget. Part of what we have to evaluate with respect to telework is a couple of things. Are we achieving our productivity goals? And we had a very strong filing season, so in many ways, a lot of our productivity goals were achieved. We have to stay competitive in the labor market, and we want to make sure that we're providing good flexibility versus what other employers might provide, and we want to meet the government-wide standard. So there's a lot to balance here.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're talking with OMB about the government-wide standard because, of
enough.
course, these teleworking practices were put in under COVID, meant to be temporary, and coming out of COVID, they've been made permanent. Now, from a business perspective, when you're making this decision, you're thinking, okay, I'm going to take probably a short hit, somewhat of a hit in productivity from working at home, but hey, we don't have the facility usage, so there's savings there. Can you submit to us what savings we've been able to gather? I mean, are there offices you've been able to close down, maintenance?
Believe it or not, it's mixed. In some locations, we have space issues because people are shifting to smaller telework footprints over time and working on site. In some cases, we have excess real estate, and we're working to offload that real estate. It's not always the case that you lose productivity when people are working off-site. It just depends on the situation.
A lot of it depends on the individual, right?
And the situation.
The IRS has committed significant resources to ensure taxpayers who navigate the 7,000-page tax code pay the proper amount, which they should. That's the job. But we were talking about the FY '23 Treasury reported a staggering 33% of improper payments for the earned income tax credit. So we were just talking about that.
Yes.
What are you doing to reduce those improper payments?
Yeah, this is a really important point because it is that high improper payment rate that I believe led to the large number of audits in this program. We have to balance. There is a part of that error rate that is more concerning than another part of that error rate. So part of that error rate is direct fraud or a a nefarious preparer who steals the EITC from the eligible applicant. And part of that error rate is the dependent child lived with the parent for 4 months out of the year rather than 6 months out of the year, and that's the eligibility issue. In a constrained resource environment, we have to make choices.
Can you
And
break that down for us, maybe? Like that 33%, I mean, 33%.
yeah,
seems
yes, we can
substantial.
get you more information on that. I would say that a large part of the error is kind of more of this technical error where it's the number of months you've lived with your dependent child. What my commitment is on EITC improper payments, is to go after and correct the errors that are more nefarious, that are more likely to compromise trust in the tax system. I wish we could get all the error, but we have to prioritize.
I have just a couple of seconds. I don't have any reason to think anything about these questions, except you mentioned that the IRS does not sell data. Was happy to hear that, but that sparked a couple questions for me.
Please.
Do you purchase data?
Do we purchase data? I don't believe we purchase data. I mean,
And-
maybe we
and-
purchase benchmark information on real estate
Well, on
costs.
individuals, on people.
No, we
Yeah,
do not.
On citizens.
We do not.
Do you share data with other agencies, or do other agencies have access to your data without a warrant or subpoena?
Yes, under section 6103 of the code, there are statutorily established data sharing environments where, like, for example, we share data with HHS to help with their child support enforcement. We share data with the education department as around aligning with student aid eligibility. So there are these buckets of areas, but otherwise, beyond, if it's not prescribed in statute in section 6103, we do not share it.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cloud. Commissioner Werfel, all good things must come to an end. There may be some members that would also like to submit questions for the record.
Absolutely.
Please submit any questions for the record within the next 7 days. And I'd ask you, as I have other people in the past, to try to respond to those, as you said you
Yes.
would, within 15 business days after the receipt of them. Again, I'd like to thank you for being here today and the opportunity to have this discourse with you. And this meeting is now concluded.